Okay, great. Hello and welcome to the Charter Cities Institute's Quarterly Digital Roundtable. These digital roundtables seek to promote conversation and provide introductions among relevant stakeholders who are engaged in some facet of city development in Africa, including but not limited to investing, building, hosting, and governing. Today we have growth teams. We'll start with a round of introductions. I'm Carl Peterson, the Senior Manager for Special Projects at the Charter Cities Institute. When I call your name, please tell us who you are, your institution, and your role there. So we'll go ahead and we'll start. Kartik, because you're presenting, we'll have you go first.
Great. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Kartik Akileswaran. I'm a founder of Growth Teams.
Great. Ingrid.
Hi, I'm Ingrid Westman. I live in Sweden and I'm the owner of Friendly Building. We work together with our own, it is our own association. Present.
Great. Siska.
Hi, I'm Suska. I am working with Carl in special projects.
Heba.
Yep, I'm Heba. I wear two hats today. So I'm an urban planner and researcher with Charter Cities Institute. I'm also part of the Africa Urban Lab team. So I'm also, I do deputy chief of staff there. Thank you.
Jonathan. Sorry, I think I should have had you go after Kartik.
No. Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan Mazumdar. I'm, the other founder of Growth Teams. So I was keen to listen in.
Great. Jaidi.
Hey everyone, looking forward to this. My name is Jaidi Chida. I am also part of the special projects team at CCI.
Kirk. And if Kirk stepped away from his
You're
computer.
muted, Kirk. You need to turn on your microphone.
Yeah, my microphone. Okay. I'm Kirk. I'm with Maroon Associates. They're located in North Carolina. I'm with Ingrid and Jude.
Awesome. Martin.
I'm on mute. My name's Martin. I'm part of a startup called West Africa Free Zones, and we're trying to do a charter city type project in Ghana and Nigeria.
Great. John.
Hi, John Wheatley. I'm an infrastructure attorney with Ballard Spar LLP in Washington, D.C.
Great. And I think I just saw Jude, but it looks like he popped out for a second. And I'm sure we'll have more people pop in as the call goes on. But did I miss anyone? Great. In that case, Kartik, I'll turn it over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for having me, CCI team. Maybe I'll start by just saying a tiny bit about what Growth Teams does. I think that will help to situate the conversation and sort of explain, the perspective that we come from. So, in short, what we do is we support governments in developing countries, namely in sub-Saharan Africa and in India, to deliver on their inclusive growth strategies. So, I've noticed that a number of the people on this call come more from the private sector side, or perhaps the sort of urban/city side, and our team focuses on a complementary piece of the puzzle, which is on governments, trying to get governments to play their role more effectively. So the talk today, I think, is very much geared towards the role of the private sector, and I'll sprinkle in a few points about what government can do to enable that. It's I don't have a huge amount of pragmatic practical advice today. I hope that's not what people are looking for, but I think it'll be a really useful, interesting conversation nonetheless. And I think I'll have a lot to discuss and learn from everyone on this call. So with that, maybe I'll get started. So the title has been up for a few minutes now, so I'm not sure what people are thinking, but I thought I'd try to put something catchy there. So what I'm going to speak about today is about the importance of know-how for for growth and development. And I'll sort of get to what know-how actually is. But let me first start with a story, as people tend to like. Okay. So okay. Here we go. Here I have, I'm showing you sort of a tale of two sectors in Kenya. Right? I know that a lot of the people on this call are probably focused on sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a part of the world where I've spent many years in the past. So I've worked in West Africa and in East Africa. So I have some familiarity. Yeah, I thought I'd start with this story to say, okay, let's look at two sort of within the same country. So, that more or less holds a number of variables constant. Let's see sort of the performance of two different sectors, right? So cut flower exports on the left, that's from 1995 to 2021, and leather and skins exports on the right during the same time period. And a couple of bullet points below each. I think, what stands out immediately just looking at the charts is that cut flowers exports in Kenya have sort of grown by 8x over this time period, while over the same time period, livestock generally, but sort of I'm taking leather and skins as sort of one component of the livestock sector. It's sort of with some major fluctuations in between. During that period, it stayed more or less constant, right? There's a couple of other facts down there about cut flowers and about livestock. I think on the right-hand side on livestock, I just wanted to call out that I've picked up two different reports written 13 years apart. And they basically indicate that the livestock sector in Kenya accounts for the same percentage of Kenya's overall GDP and the same percentage of its agricultural GDP. So essentially, it's not really taken off, right, in any way. Nothing close to what cut flowers has done, right? So, one question that immediately comes to mind is that sort of, you could tell the same story about pick other sectors in Kenya or look at other countries, right? Some sectors would have done better than others, and those sectors may have had an outsized impact on those countries' economic growth stories, right? So the question naturally then becomes sort of like, why? There's many reasons, of course, and I'm not going to touch on all of them, but I've put down a framework here just to sort of identify some key elements of the story. Again, not comprehensive. But first is political alignment, right? So in cut flowers, it was a new sector at the time, sort of that it started taking off in Kenya, right? Which was sort of, I think it started in the 1970s, but really started taking off after that, right? In the following decades, 1980s, from there on. And so because it was a new sector around that time, there weren't sort of vested interests, right? So political alignment, you could call that, right? There weren't sort of political vested interests to fight to be able to actually get this off the ground. Second is what I call government action, right? So key enabling laws and investments. So, there's like a terminal at the airport in Kenya that is specifically geared towards flying, roses from Nairobi to Europe on like a daily basis or, a regular basis anyway. And then a facilitative role from sort of a key agency in the government that sort of was enabled investment to flow into this space, along with sort of some productive collaboration with the private sector entity, which is called the Kenya Flower Council. But the piece that I'm going to focus on today, which is the private sector piece, is entrepreneurship, and specifically foreign entrepreneurship. So I put the names down of a few key players that really had an important role in launching the cut flower sector in Kenya. Importantly, they were all foreigners. And I'll come to why that's particularly important. But the bottom line, to sort of cut to the chase, is that because this sector was not really a major sort of it did not have major investment and major sort of growth going on before sort of foreign investors came in. They came in and brought not only the sort of capital, technology, and all that, but the know-how. So that's the point of the presentation, is that know-how really matters. And know-how is basically knowing how, literally, to bring together all these different elements, the capital with the technology, with the labor, and with sort of knowledge of the production process to be able to actually make this product in that place. So make cut flowers and export them from Kenya specifically. That's know-how, bringing all these different pieces together. So that's going to be the focus of the presentation today. So just to take a step back, just to situate sort of this idea of know-how, I'll briefly describe what's called the Scrabble theory of development, which is you can think of an economy like the game of Scrabble. I think everyone must be familiar with that. In Scrabble, you have to the goal is to construct words out of a set of letters that you're given, right? Now in Scrabble, you have a fixed set of letters, right? So you have, I think, 7. I was playing it recently, so I should know this. But you have 7 letters, and every time you make a word on the board, you have to sort of keep your number of letters constant. Now, the difference with economies in the real world is that you don't have a 7-letter limit in the real world. Actually, you can accumulate more letters than that, right? And naturally, the more letters that you have as an economy, the more words you can make. And by word, you can think of products or services, right? So basically, the more letters you have, the more words you can make, meaning the more products and services you can make. So the letters are essentially know-how, or in other terms, capabilities, right? So in order for an economy to grow, it needs to be able to produce more and more sophisticated goods and services, right? So in Scrabble terms, you need to go from making words like hat, which has 3 letters, to making words like pharmaceuticals, which has many more letters, right? And in the real world, making hats is actually less complex. It's less sophisticated than making pharmaceuticals. So what does that imply? It implies that basically for developing countries especially, one of their key objectives should be to try to figure out, how do we get more productive capabilities in our economies? How do we get more letters so that then we can make more and more sophisticated things, right? So that's sort of the basic, the bottom line around know-how. And a lot, know-how is oftentimes tacit, right? As I was saying, it's bringing together all these different components. Even if you were to write those things down, it's not entirely clear that if you were to just give that written down sort of stuff to somebody else in another country, that they can then automatically replicate it, right? And so this is why it's so important that we're able to draw upon foreign expertise to be able to actually acquire those capabilities and that know-how, right? So as an example, these tables are from a paper that was written about trying to characterize what happened in Detroit and in Silicon Valley in the US to be able to launch the automobile and the sort of semiconductor and IT sectors in those places respectively. Those are world famous sort of clusters, you could say, of in those sectors. And so what happened there? In particular, there were other parts of the US that actually were able to attract investment in exactly those sectors, whether it be in automobiles or in semiconductors. Yet we don't think about those other places in the US as sort of the hubs for these sectors, right? So what actually happened? And one of the explanations that's out there is essentially that the labor mobility, or you could think about it as the movement of brains, because that's where know-how sits. Know-how sits in each of our brains. We each know how to do certain sorts of things that may be difficult to write down on paper, right? So it sits in our brains. So the way to actually get know-how from one place to the other, the easiest way potentially is to actually move people, right? And so these tables essentially show that. So these are tables of, on the left-hand side, automobile companies in Detroit, and on the right-hand side, semiconductor companies in Silicon Valley. And what I've highlighted in red, what I've outlined in red, is the column that shows the spin-offs, right? So this is essentially how many spin-offs were there from each of these companies. So on the left-hand side, you can see Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, Ford. These had a number of different spin-offs. So 7, 7, 4, 4, 3, 2. And there, I didn't include this, I don't have space, but in the same paper, which is listed at the very bottom, in the bottom left, they show tables of spin-offs in other places that had automobile companies, for instance. And the spin-offs in those places were much lower, 1 oftentimes. And then likewise, on the right-hand side, spin-offs in semiconductors. So Fairchild is the most famous one. That might be one that many of you have heard of, Fairchild Semiconductors. They had 24 spin-offs. So basically people that were working at Fairchild, 24 of them at least, spun off and created their own companies after working for Fairchild. They left Fairchild and created their own semiconductor companies. So essentially you can think about that as a movement of brains, right? So people that work for Fairchild, they moved their brains literally and created new companies, right? And essentially the explanation is that has an important role, explanatory role in sort of the ability of these places to become hubs for these sectors. So fine. So movement of brains, labor mobility, etc. That's how we move know-how. It's much harder to move it through writing things down on paper and just giving it to people in other places. How does it happen? Right. So there's sort of like 3 main channels through which we can think about moving brains. So one is diaspora. And I think that one is clear, right? And it happens quite often. So I put some examples in the right-hand column. So semiconductors in Taiwan, that's exactly what happened. Many of you maybe have read the book Chip Wars, where I think he goes through the story, but it's written up elsewhere as well, which is essentially the person that founded TSMC, or one of the key people. They'd actually been working in the US prior, and then they were wooed back. In fact, they had started another business, and then that sort of was going well, but then, they were actually wooed back, but they were also wanting to go back to Taiwan to get involved in what was going on there. And so combination of that, they went back, and, that's part of the reason why we have TSMC. Likewise in India, the IT sector. Big part of the reason is that a lot of Indians migrated to the US, and then they came back and were able to kickstart the IT sector in India, which is why India's IT exports now are something like, on the order of $400 billion a year, one of the biggest in the world. So diaspora has a, really, a critical and unique role to play, given that, diaspora are by definition attached to a specific country. Second major channel through which, know-how is moved through people's brains is FDI. I think this one might be sort of quite close to what many of the people on this call do or are involved in. So there's dozens and maybe hundreds of examples of how FDI has actually enabled not only foreign capital to flow into developing countries, but also foreign know-how. I've just listed a couple of interesting examples here. The Korean and Taiwan one is a very interesting one. I'll just mention because actually one of the key elements there was that there was, I think, a Korean soldier that was, did I get this right? That was imprisoned in a prisoner of war camp in Indonesia, and met a prison guard there that then he became close to. And that prison guard then went on to do business in Indonesia. And that sort of like made the link between Korea and Indonesia in this specific sector around forestry and plywood. It's a very interesting story. I'm happy to share some sources around that if people are interested. But yeah, you wouldn't think this know-how transfer would happen through prison camps, but anyway. And then the Costa Rica example for electronics is a more well-known one, where Intel worked very closely with the government of Costa Rica to basically figure out how do we set up shop in Costa Rica. And to their credit, the Costa Rican government was very keen on it and made a huge effort to basically figure out what does Intel need to be able to set up shop here. And long story short, Intel basically kickstarted the entire ecosystem of electronics in Costa Rica, which involves dozens of suppliers now, many of which are local firms, and huge number of exports for the Costa Rican economy. And then the third channel that exists is sort of a combination of a number of different things, but you can think about it like joint ventures, technology, or acquiring foreign companies that have particular sort of capabilities or know-how, and sort of just buying the company straight out so that your country can sort of get access to that technology and to that know-how. So perhaps one of the most famous examples of this is Daewoo and Desh garments in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh's garment sector was essentially kickstarted exactly through a joint venture. So initially, Daewoo recruited Bangladeshis. They took them to Korea, trained them up for a matter of, I think, 10 months or a year. And then they sent them back and set up a factory in Bangladesh with these trained workers. Also with Koreans that they sent there who lived there for several years, working with the sort of local workers there. And then not only that, then people from that firm, from that factory, then spun off and created their own garments factories in Bangladesh. So actually, it's sort of a combination of a number of different things that went on there. But that's why Bangladesh is the world's second leading, exporter of garments. That started, 40, 50 years ago. And then another great one that's perhaps close to people's hearts here on this call is Ethiopian Airlines. So Ethiopian Airlines, as you know, is sort of Ethiopia's biggest export and the sort of biggest African airline. And that started with the partnership with Trans World Airlines, TWA. So let's see, what's my next slide? Yeah, so I think one common refrain to this point of view is that, well, can't we get this know-how just by improving our education? And there's a lot of stuff here. I won't go through it, but I've basically pulled on Joe Studwell's very interesting book, which is called How Asia Works. I recommend people reading that if you haven't. But essentially, there's 2 points to be made here. One is that the evidence on the link between educational attainment and GDP growth is much, much weaker than you might assume. That's just the evidence. That's the empirical evidence. That actually, schooling your people more doesn't actually help you to grow faster. At least historically. Maybe that's changing right now. Maybe that'll change in the future. But historically, the empirical relationship is quite weak. And you can, and I think what's interesting is that literacy rates, for example, in Taiwan and South Korea, in the early stages of their growth journeys, were incredibly low, much lower than what they are in many, many African countries today. So Taiwan, I think it was something like half the population was illiterate. South Korea, something similar, etc. Second point here is that I think what's important to take account of for developing countries, especially sort of lower middle income and below, is that the most critical learning and acquisition of know-how takes place in firms, not in schools. So there could be many reasons for that. One is that the quality of education in schools in many developing countries is really bad. But the other thing is that what you learn in schools is perhaps not really actually even relevant to what you learn in firms when you're actually working, when you're actually trying to figure out how do we make this product in this place and how do we make it to the right quality such that we can sell it to the rest of the world, right? Again, there's some nice facts here that actually there's a number of countries that trained up loads of engineers, right? Engineers are important, but the Asian countries, a lot of them, they actually train their engineers after their growth journeys took off. Right. And then you have examples like Cuba and Russia, who also trained vast numbers of engineers, but we don't cite them as growth miracles, right? So, right. So just a couple more slides, I believe. Just wanted to mention, I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to mention that our view is that what we call modern industrial policy can actually accelerate know-how acquisition and thus economic success. And in fact, perhaps this should be one of the key objectives of modern industrial policy, not necessarily to just throw subsidies and other forms of money at sort of firms that are well connected to the government and, trying to pick winners and all that. Perhaps that's not the actually best form of industrial policy. In fact, I think empirically, historically, it's not. Maybe the better way to approach it is to actually try to figure out how to get the know-how into your country that you need to be able to actually produce new sorts of products in cost-effective and high-quality ways. So we sort of think there's a number of different sort of other more creative tools that we can think about in the industrial policy toolkit that we should be paying more attention to and trying to actually experiment with more. So one is sort of public-private collaboration. So there's all sorts of interesting examples of how governments have tried to actually leverage different forms of public-private collaboration to actually figure out, okay, not only what are the problems in this particular sector that has a lot of potential for our country, but also like how do we actually get the right know-how at the table? How do we get the right know-how into this space in our country so that we can actually level up? So the example from Peru of mesas ejecutivas is a very interesting one. I encourage people to look it up. I can share resources. But that was one where they basically said, we're not even talking about subsidies. So they brought the private sector together with the government, with the Ministry of Production. And they said, we're not even going to talk about subsidies. What we're going to talk about is whether it be technology, whether it be labor, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be skills, etc. Right? How do we make it work? Regulation, policy. So very interesting example. They had a lot of success with that. That methodology has been rolled out in a number of other Latin American countries since then. Another form is sort of public-public coordination. So as many of you might know, governments are not monoliths. They're made up of a bunch of different organizations, essentially agencies that have all sorts of competing incentives. And they oftentimes struggle with coordinating with each other, which is why you oftentimes see the Ministry of Industry having one set of policies over here, and the Ministry of Trade having a totally different set of policies over here, and the Ministry of Finance having a different set of policies over there. And as you can imagine, that causes lots of problems for private investors. So there's a lot of things to be done to basically try to solve that intra-government coordination problem. So again, a number of examples on the right-hand side where governments have actually tried to figure that out and done so successfully. Essentially, like, just to wrap up, I think the bottom line is twofold. One is openness to the rest of the world is important for African countries, especially because they are precisely the countries that this openness means. It means in terms of trade, FDI, workers, knowledge, people that have the knowledge in their brains that can't be written down. All this sort of openness is really important, and it might have to manifest in different sorts of ways because it has to be politically acceptable, or else, as we've seen all over the world, there's going to be a backlash, right? So that has to be done with savvy, has to be done in the right sort of way, but it's really critical, especially for a lot of African countries that don't already have complex, highly sophisticated economies, right? And what we see in lots of African countries is that there are reservations about this, right? You have lots of difficulties getting visas for workers and lots of difficulties in trying to bring foreign investment, restrictions, all that sort of stuff, right? And I can understand where that comes from. But as I was saying, is that in the long term, that's not actually going to solve sort of the economic growth challenge for these countries. And so there could be ways to think about trying to separate some of these issues. So separating the know-how acquisition challenge from the, say, immigration sort of political sensitivity, right? So you could think about trying to fast track sort of time-bound work permits for skilled workers that have, depth of experience in particular important sectors for countries, and have some sort of plan to sort of say, okay, we're going to phase them out. We're going to try to get them to, try to transfer their know-how to local workers, right? There could be different sorts of methods like that. And some countries are already experimenting with that, but, probably we need to figure out how to make the implementation more effective. And there could be other ways of experimenting with trying to separate the political questions from the sort of economic ones. And then the second point I want to close with is that zones and other sorts of agglomerations are promising vessels for receiving, nurturing, and transferring know-how, right? So foreign players, in many cases, are critical to making zones flourish. That's been the case all over the world. But they may not come if the zones themselves don't already exist, right? Foreign investors may not come if the zones with the better sort of investment environment that they provide don't already exist. So there's a chicken and egg problem here where government maybe has an important role to play. And as I was saying before, beyond subsidies, there's lots of other things that governments can do to try to actually, make zones not only attractive places for investors to set up shop, but also to enable sort of those investors to contribute to the building of a broader ecosystem where the know-how that they have can be actually transferred and percolated to other actors in the system. So, again, beyond subsidies, sector sort of having a focused sector strategy, infrastructure investment that's aligned to the needs of the specific sort of high potential sectors, public-private collaboration, I was talking about, all sorts of other tools of modern industrial policy can help to solve these problems. But the bottom line here is that I know there's a number of people here that care about zones and cities and agglomerations. They can be a really important tool for sort of promoting the acquisition of know-how. So I think with that, I will close. Thanks very much for your attention, and happy to discuss.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kartik. We appreciate it. The floor is open for questions. And it's always helpful to use the raise hand function. But Siska, you have something.
I'll physically raise my hand. So yeah, I think a lot of what you said, kind of this idea of like knowledge acquisition for a country through, let's say, foreign direct investment and also then returning diaspora, to me kind of speaks to strengthen local institutions, and then also having local institutions that have some, or local national institutions that have some kind of perceived trustworthiness attached to them. And so how would you, let's say you were advising a government on this knowledge acquisition process, how would you go about kind of advising them to build their local institutions? Or is the local institution, is that important as I perceive?
I think so, because I think private investors won't even entertain sort of investing in a place unless there's some level of predictability, clarity, transparency, not only in the sort of what's written down in the sort of legal and regulatory frameworks, but also like if I set up shop somewhere, in a country, can I be confident that the people in power, the literal people in power, won't come and try to expropriate me? So that level of predictability is also important. So I think, if that's not there, then, there's no point trying to even embark. I mean, you can try, and there may be ways. I mean, as I was saying before, governments are not monoliths. So there could be sort of some windows of opportunity where, say, an enterprising Minister of Finance or an enterprising, industries minister or something, has enough political backing, say, to be able to, pursue foreign investment, to be able to set up a zone, to be able to, do something of that nature. There could be opportunities like that, but I think there is some minimum level of political backing that is required, political space, you could say, or authorization that is required for any agents in the system like that to be able to pursue it, right? So I guess another way to put it is that I think sometimes we think, oh, the domestic environment has to be, all sorted out and like has to be clear and predictable. And I don't know any country historically that has developed, that has had all the ducks in a row. I mean, if you look at the late 1800s in the US, a lot of things were an utter mess. I mean, there was a massively contested election in 1892, like where no one knew who won the election. We didn't know who the president was going to be, etc. And yet that was literally in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, right? So I think that an example like that should suggest to us that everything doesn't have to be perfect, that we should actually start with what we have and see what we can do based on that. But there's a balance between that sort of perspective and, say, having a completely failed state, right? Obviously, in that situation, forget it. But I think sometimes we are too pessimistic that like, oh gosh, the laws and regulations are a mess. Like, we don't know what to do. Like, you got to fix all that stuff first before you can even think about trying to attract investment. And I think history suggests that it didn't quite work like that. That actually there was sort of a co-evolution process that happened where, there was a good enough sort of environment in this specific place or in that specific SEZ or whatever, right? Or that specific politician wanted to get something done. And then you start with that and then sort of stuff builds from there, right? And just actually having that starting point can actually help the broader sort of business environment to shape up, right? Because essentially all this is about political economy, right? So if there's no constituency in the country trying to actually get the sort of business environment to improve, then why should it improve? It won't, right? So the political economy really matters. And for that, you need a constituency domestically to be asking for that. And so again, it's a chicken and egg thing, that how do you get the constituency if the environment is not already there, right? Because no investor will want to come. But that being said, we do see some investment happening in lots of places where the business environment is far from perfect, right? All over Africa is the case. So, you're absolutely right to point to sort of the domestic environment being really important. And what I would add on to that is that like sort of it doesn't have to be perfect, even if it is important.
Kartik, I have a couple questions actually. So my first question deals with sort of organic vice, like inorganic, like exchange, basically, right? So you talk about things like diaspora groups being very influential in terms of development. They live abroad for a while, they develop some kind of know-how, they return home, bring that know-how home and help grow economies. I think if you look at like some very successful companies, certainly at least in the past, some of them were structured in sort of similar ways with idea exchange. I think Gore-Tex is a good example. I think early Apple is another good example of you basically had these individuals or these teams who'd spend a lot of time very seriously working solely on their individual sort of project. And then maybe once a week or so, or once a day, they'd sort of meet in a common area where they'd, grab donuts or whatever and chat with each other. And then you get sort of this idea exchange, idea flow. Do you have sort of any research or anything that sort of indicates the ability of states or companies to sort of replicate these things? Because to some degree, my feeling is, especially with diasporas, a lot of these folks are already sort of self-selected, right? Especially if you have like a diaspora that was in the US maybe 20 or 30 years ago. The US has a very Byzantine immigration system. If you are capable of sort of navigating this and being, working in tech, you're probably already a very capable person. So this is a very like self-selected group. And are governments and companies capable of trying to replicate this to some degree, and how successfully can they replicate this idea exchange on their own? And I guess that's my sort of initial question, sort of open-ended there for you, and then I'll ask my second one after you answer here.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there's potentially lots of ways that that governments say can try to promote diaspora circulation, you could call it. Right, private sector already does it, right? I mean, any developing country you go to that has foreign investment, you'll see foreigners around that are working for companies from their home country. Just full stop. That's there. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. Some of those people are just foreigners, foreign born. Some of them are diaspora, right? So can be a mix. So the private sector has a strong incentive to do this, right? Because if they decided to make, an investment in some place, then they want to make sure that that works. And to increase the chance of that investment working in another place, then of course they're going to rely on sort of the people that they have in house that they trust to be able to like go to that place. They already know sort of how the company operates, what they're trying to do, etc., and they know the details about how they do what they do. So governments, meanwhile, governments all over the world are trying to engage diaspora more effectively. So I mean, India has a very extensive engagement with diaspora, but lots of African countries do as well. I mean, we work in Tanzania, they have diaspora forum. They could probably use them more effectively, surely. But there's sort of one part of it is engagement, right? So you could think about that sort of information and relationship building, right? So providing information to diaspora about what's going on in their home country, and then trying to actually deepen networks with them. But then there are other aspects as well, which is that you can actually try to incentivize diaspora to come back and set up companies, or try to work in the domestic private sector. There are all sorts of, I think, policy tools you could use for that, right? You could give particular forms of support, financial and other support, specifically to diaspora that have certain sets of skills, right? Potentially, right? So yeah, I absolutely think there's ways to do that. Examples, yeah, that is an interesting question. I'd have to dig some of those up, because I think, say, 50 years ago, where there were diaspora coming back to, say, India or other places, I think that was more organic. That's my understanding. Perhaps the policy toolkit was not so deep back then to be able to work on this, but now it's definitely grown. So yeah, I'd also be curious on that. I'd have to look into it.
Is my follow-up question there too, that kind of touches on some of your answer there. I did invite a number of government folks to this call. Some committed, but no one showed. But they'll get this recording afterward. So you have also, though, on the call right now, a few entrepreneurs who are working on new city projects in different parts of Africa. So without putting you on the spot too much, I hope, is there some sort of advice you would have for both private sector and then public sector folks on how best to leverage, I guess, idea exchange, or skill exchange, let's call it, for these two different sets of stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would not want to be too presumptuous to even know what are the specific problems that. Yeah, so I would defer to the city developers on this call to hear more from them about what do they grapple with on a regular basis.
It looked like, Ingrid, you were trying to raise your hand.
Yeah, I'm an entrepreneur, and I think we like predictability. Things are predictable. So it can be really stupid rules, but we adjust to them. But it's when you try to change the rules and try to make them better and better, and you change them every year, it's a nightmare. It's better to have something that lasts for a long time, so you know how to deal with it. Everything else we solve. As long as we know the rules, we solve them. But if you keep changing the games in a football play every 10 minutes, you're not going to know how to play the game. But even if you hate the rules, you will still play the football game the way it is. So yeah, so for me, I suggest that keep it stable for us who try to run companies. So the environment doesn't change too much, the rules and taxes and stuff like that.
I'd love to hear if other people have thoughts.
So something I discussed with a team on a project that never ended up taking off, but one of the things that we wanted to do was try to negotiate a concession where we would actually have a guaranteed number of visas. I think we're going to ask for 5,000 visas a year that we could approve ourselves, right? And this was a few years ago. I don't remember if we ever looked into if there was a precedence for this in another country, whether this was run by a zone or something. So I'm curious if you know of a similar program elsewhere.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Just
No?
a thought
Oh,
on
go ahead, please, yeah.
the opposite of knowledge acquisition, which is people leaving. Unilever is recently leaving Nigeria, So I was trying to say why did that happen? And it was largely down to currency exchange as opposed to knowledge exchange. So the naira was being devalued. So the company just couldn't make a profit. So two thoughts on that. Do you think that you have to focus on exports in order to build a sector that is going to flourish, given the risk of currency devaluation in Africa? And also, do you think you have to provide startups with a facility to keep their hard currency rather than forcing them to change it into Zimbabwe dollars, which will devalue at any moment? You've done a whole year's work and suddenly you're devalued by 40% overnight. So just a thought there.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So maybe I can respond to Martin's point first, and then I'll circle back to Jaidy and Ingrid to try to connect those. So yeah, Martin, your point. So are exports necessary? And there could be other sort of factors at play. So on exports, maybe one way to sort of like encapsulate the point is that China is no longer the world's biggest country. It's the second biggest country in the world, population-wise. So if there's, but that being said, it was the world's biggest country until last year, or I think till this year. The world's biggest country over the last 40 years has also become one of the world's biggest exporters. So if you can't, as China, not solely, but heavily rely on your domestic market to achieve high rates of growth, then I'm pretty sure that no other country can, because they have a giant country and what is today quite a large domestic market. That's an example, I think, that is powerful. But more conceptually, I think exports are absolutely important for this reason of market size, right? If most countries are not big enough to be able to actually absorb the amount of production that you want to reach, to be able to get scale economies and to be able to compete globally, to get sort of prices down and quality up, right? So by definition, I think to reach those benchmarks in terms of price and quality, you actually have to reach a scale that goes beyond your domestic market. Number two, if you only serve your domestic market, you're actually somehow potentially turning the terms of trade against yourself in the long run. That actually exporting allows you to keep your currency relatively undervalued compared to what it would be if you were only serving the domestic market. And then third is that, and perhaps most importantly, is that exports force you to increase your quality. So they force, because you're competing with a much greater set of competitors, it forces you to actually learn how to make whatever you're making to a higher standard, to a higher quality. And of course, if you can make a particular product to a higher quality, you can charge more for it. You can charge more for it, you get more money, bottom line. And that's essentially the mechanism through which countries, bit by bit, are able to then raise their wages for people to earn more income, etc. Right? It's not the only mechanism, of course, but it's a key one, right? So I do believe that exports are critical. There are a handful of countries that can rely relatively more on their domestic market, but I think historically there really is no experience of a major country, major meaning like it's not a small island nation or something. There's no, in fact, they have more dependence on exports. But yeah, there's no example, I think, of a major country that has basically, substantially relied on like the domestic market to reach high income status. Its exports are essential. The other point about sort of Unilever and why they left, it's a great point. So we dealt with, when I was in Ethiopia, I was working closely with the government there, and that was a big problem there as well. They've just now a couple months ago liberalized their currency regime, but like it's the same issue, that there was a scarcity of forex, and so firms were having trouble buying inputs, and they weren't getting like they weren't getting their payments on time, and from the central bank, and all sorts of problems. So I mean, in Unilever's case, Unilever was bringing the know-how, and in fact, that's what Nigeria was getting out of the deal. And so it seems to me like Nigeria wasn't able to solve the problem that Unilever was facing. So sort of the exchange that was taking place, wasn't effective for Unilever, right? That Nigeria wasn't holding up its end of the bargain, so to speak, in terms of trying to solve, step by step, the problems that were hampering Unilever to be able to operate in Nigeria. And so, Nigeria has lost that investment, which is probably, I imagine it's unfortunate. I don't know much about Nigeria, but I'm sure probably a lot of commentators and observers believe that that's probably not a good thing. So yeah. Ingrid, on your point, predictability, that really resonated with me a whole lot. That actually you don't have to have the perfect laws, but as long as you have them in place for a long enough period of time, that's what matters. I totally hear you there. And that's actually, I think I've learned over the years that perhaps is the most difficult challenge, precisely because the politics make that difficult. Every 5 years they have an election, or every 6 years, or whatever it is, every 4 years. And the new guy usually wants to do something different from the previous guy, right? To distinguish himself. And that creates problems. And that can even happen at the level of the bureaucracy. Maybe there's a ministerial reshuffle and like a new minister is in place and they want to do something different. And I completely hear you. And I don't think there's any easy solutions there, which is why zones can.
If we vote every 5 years, that would be okay, because that's a longer time period. Before the election, they already talk about the new laws.
Absolutely.
So it's like you already try to plan for them 2 years ahead, and the market already starts to plan for them a year ahead. And so it becomes much shorter. And then they start to talk about another one. This is the whole thing that makes things complicated.
Yeah, absolutely right.
That's why it would be good. Why it's also a good thing to have partners, because there we have the rules for a certain time, and we say, this is how we're going to be in this area for this time. And everything can be calm. We can keep working on what we need to do and not adjusting on it. So that's more important than having what I think, than having lower taxes or whatever it is. It is that it will be a calmness there.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. And what I would say is that there's no easy technical solution to that problem. Right, there's nothing that we can sort of just put into place per se, today or tomorrow or whatever, and solve that. That's why, so as I was saying before, sort of this point about political economy and political authorization is very important. That being said, there could be, there could be some tools that perhaps are more able to sort of help with that problem, right? So I think zones are potentially one tool for that. They're not immune. There's no silver bullet here at all. They're not immune. But if there's one government or one set of key leaders in the government that sort of make a commitment to a zone, because it's a large sort of lumpy investment, that maybe makes it actually more likely that if there's some change in who's in place or whatever, that that person is maybe less likely to meddle with it. I don't know. It's somewhat of an empirical question, but I absolutely hear you on the point about predictability. So yeah, I wish I had a silver bullet, but there isn't one. So I think
all over the world, but it's a message for politicians.
Exactly right. Exactly. And I think maybe sort of on the private sector side, to circle back to what Carl was sort of hinting at earlier, one thing to really face up to in terms of like how things really work is that absolutely the laws and the regulations and the policies matter. They do. And so when those change, that matters. And that creates a lot of chaos and a lot of uncertainty for investors, as you're rightfully pointing out. I think in a lot of developing countries, what matters equally, if not more, is actually the people who are in power, the people who have decision-making authority, right? Because ultimately, as all of you know, what is written down on paper can oftentimes be considered guidance more than law. So there is wiggle room. We don't want to admit that oftentimes because that seems icky to us, because in our home countries, I'm American, in our home countries, like it's sort of not the case, like the law is the law. But the law wasn't the law 150 years ago in the US. Even then, it was a bit more sort of flexible, right? So these things harden, they sort of, they become more binding over time. And that's sort of an outcome of the development process, I would argue. And so when you look at countries that are in the early stages of their development, we have to really grapple with the reality that actually the people also matter. And I think the upshot of that for investors and for entrepreneurs is that, perhaps it's also useful. This is obviously not part of your job. I completely understand that. And, it shouldn't necessarily be part of your job. But the reality is this, that perhaps an important strategy to explore is to actually build relationships with the key decision makers. And that can actually sort of help you to get problem solved, but also help you to see the future in a way, to see if there are sort of things coming down the pipeline that are going to affect your business. Again, it's not necessarily something that you should have to do in an ideal situation, but we don't live in the ideal world. So the reality is this, and oftentimes, see, look, there are private investors out there that are going to be building relationships with politicians to get favors. That's a fact. That's just a given, right? A lot of these people went to school with the politicians, right? Because they're from that country and that they already know each other. And they're going to be looking for favors. And so actually, as I was saying earlier about constituencies, what we need in many countries is a counter constituency, a counterweight, a counterbalance from entrepreneurs, investors who aren't just looking for handouts, but are actually looking for a better business environment. We need that counterbalance, that counterweight from the private sector. And so I think people who are like, people on this call, and your peers and your colleagues and all that, you can actually, you're probably more of the type that want a better business environment than are just looking for handouts. And so as a result of that, in some sense, it is partly your role to sort of try to play that counterweight. And that's where sort of building relationships with bureaucrats, with decision makers can be important. Jaidi, the thing that you said, so absolutely, there are all sorts, I've worked on sort of, developing policies and such where we talk about like, okay, let's actually do fast track visas for skilled workers from abroad and all this stuff. So that sort of thing, a lot of countries are trying to do that, at least on paper. The question is, how is it working in practice? Is it complicated? Is it easy? I don't know. This thing about 5,000 visa, I don't know that a specific example, but I do know for a fact that many African countries are, they say at least that we want to attract skilled workers. Sometimes they say something about, oh, you need to like phase out, and the managers of your firm need to sort of be locals, or at least 30% locals by year 5 or year 3 or whatever it is, right? So sometimes these contingencies are put into place. But in terms of the visas themselves, oftentimes countries say that like we'll fast track them, whatever. But the question is really like what actually happens. And I think in some cases probably it's okay. but in others, maybe in other countries, maybe like in some countries, it might be much more difficult than the governments themselves are making it out to be.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I guess what I was looking for specifically is if you ever saw the zones actually being able to approve the visas unilaterally. So they would like the application would go to the zone, or the companies would send them an applicant, and then they would approve it, and then maybe it gets rubber stamped by the national government, but it was under a framework where it was actually the zone itself that had a certain number that they could approve.
I've never seen that. I think that would probably only work in the case of private zones, because government developed zones, like the government is already involved, so like it doesn't really make sense. So yeah, in the case of private zones, I've never seen it. I suspect there aren't that many examples of that because this question of visas, it gets straight to the heart of this question of sovereignty that countries that are always the question that's always top of mind for countries is that why should we hand over our ability to decide who gets into our country and who doesn't to sort of some private entity. So I would imagine that that's a hard sell. There might be some examples here and there, but as a rule, I imagine that that's a hard sell. But the next perhaps an alternative is what I was saying is that sort of perhaps you can. What I have seen is that zones being able to investors in zones being able to get sort of fast track access to visas as compared to investors outside of zones. I think that's probably a more common instrument that's used and probably just more politically feasible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen the same thing on the firm level, but I guess you would hope that the zone could maybe preempt some of that, or at least get a guarantee of a certain number of visas, even if they weren't the ones actually approving it. But thank you.
I had a question. You spoke briefly about engaging with the private sector as to infrastructure needs. What does that look like in practice? I guess give a little more background on your experience there.
Yeah, so it could take many different forms, but essentially the heart of it is this: that point number one, the private sector, and I say private sector is also not monolithic. Different sectors have different needs in terms of infrastructure, say, right? If you build a road here versus there, that might affect different industries differently, right? And so given that, investors will know much better, how certain sorts of infrastructure investments are going to affect their operations. Or alternatively, which sorts of infrastructure investments they desperately need to be able to actually make their operations more efficient. They know that much better than government. I think no one would dispute that, right? And so given that, it could be quite useful to facilitate that information exchange from private to sort of government. So that in government's own planning around infrastructure, there can be at least be some information about okay, where are the needs, right? Because government itself has limited resources, right? So they themselves always have to be making choices about, are we going to build this road or that road, or improve that port, or try to develop this cold chain, or those choices are constantly being made. And so in Peru, for example, what they did is that the minister brought together sort of at the sector level a bunch of the key private sector players alongside the key parts of government that had a role to play in actually engaging with different aspects of this sector, right? So whether it be the infrastructure ministry, education, skills ministry, et cetera, right? And basically they had a facilitated ongoing regular conversation over many, many months on a sort of bi-weekly basis, where they had a structured way of approaching sort of the information exchange process, where they said, okay, let's list out all the problems and let's go one by one to figure out, okay, yeah, is this the private sector's job? Can the government do something about this? Et cetera. So they assigned delineated roles. And then they went specifically one by one. I can't give sort of the details of that. I wasn't there, but essentially they'd go problem by problem, or sort of say like, this infrastructure is needed and it's missing. This infrastructure needs to be upgraded. This thing, they would list all that out. And then, on the government side, they'd figure out, okay, what do we need to do to actually address this, right? So, I don't know if I addressed your question.
The infrastructure projects, kind of bundle, guarantees as to, construction and so forth, bundled as part of the agreement, for a foreign entity to make an investment.
Sorry, I think I didn't quite get the first part of your question.
Would you often see a guarantee from the government to build certain infrastructure, that part of the, overall, I guess, deal with the foreign investor to come in?
Yeah, you can definitely see that in many cases. So in Ethiopia, for example, what they did is that they proactively said, well, actually, the initial, this is a great case of what you're talking about. So the initial thing, so as you might know, like sort of Ethiopia embarked upon like sort of the development of a series of industrial parks scattered all around the country. But the genesis of that was specifically oriented towards textiles. So essentially the government back in 2014, or even earlier, was engaging with a giant textiles and garment company, global one. And through their engagement with them, the company basically said, look, for us to come to Ethiopia, you would need to basically set up an industrial park and put X, Y, and Z infrastructure in that park. So like effluent treatment, all the internal infrastructure. We would need pre-built sheds, etc. Right? And so the government said, okay, fine. Yeah, we'll go and figure out the financing to be able to actually do this. So they, raise money mainly from donors and, I think maybe some private sources as well. I don't quite remember the exact sources of funding, but yeah, so they did that at the behest basically of the this large private investor, and so they developed that park in the matter of a year, I think. And the investor came, set up shop, and with them came sort of a number of ancillary firms who were essentially their suppliers, right? So, and then from there, the Ethiopian government sort of proceeded to develop a bunch of other parks that also had sector specificity in many cases. So, I worked on sort of I worked on pharmaceuticals in Ethiopia, and so they had actually, while I was there, they were developing a park that was specifically focused on pharmaceuticals, right? Again, sort of following the same model that like if we build this and we engage with investors simultaneously, that we'll be able to like sort of not only attract them, but also figure out what are the exact requirements in terms of infrastructure that we need to put into this park. So yeah, you can see examples of that not only in Ethiopia, but in other places where they've sort of successfully tried to set up zones.
That's very helpful. Thanks.
Awesome. I think this kind of brings us to time. I don't know if anyone has a last burning question they want to ask. If not, I think thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. And have a great day.